Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of SCOTONOMICS, 10 years after the independence vote. I'm really pleased to invite first of all onto screen my co-host, Karen Van Sweden. Hello, Karen, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm good. Yes, looking forward to the 18th. We have a rally in Aberdeen. So anyone from Aberdeen or the Shire watching us, 18th, we're outside Marshall College.
For the, I was going to say celebration, but it's not, is it? It's an anniversary of the independent referendum. Well, we've got a special guest joining us this evening, so please do throw in loads of live questions and comments. We're going to be discussing the Scottish and the British economy 10 years after the no vote in the referendum. And we're pleased to welcome a good friend of the show, Richard Murphy. Hello, Richard. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm very well. Good evening, everyone. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, because everyone who's following you will know how incredibly busy you are at the moment. So we're so glad, and we've only got an hour. I've told Richard we're not taking any more of his time. He's off here at 9 o'clock. So please, let's get through as many questions as comments as we possibly can. And Richard, we really hope for a really good discussion, and I think a real honest and frank discussion about where we were in 2014, what might have happened, what did happen. I don't want to look too far into the future. I just kind of want to cover this 10-year period. I think that'll be enough for us, to be honest, what's happened in economics in the last 10 years. So any questions, please throw them in. But I'm just going to start with a real kind of obvious one. And Richard, do you want to just sum up where we are from 2014 to 2024 in terms of the British, the Scottish economy? And then Karen, I'll ask you to do something similar. But over to you first, Richard. Where are we? Where are we now?
God, that's a really difficult question in a sense. And you told me what you were going to ask me, first of all, and I've been thinking about this a lot because it's quite hard to go back and remember exactly how we felt in 2014. And the answer was, we were relatively optimistic. We had survived the global financial crisis, although George Osborne and David Cameron were delivering us austerity and all the issues that went with that. The fact that we got through was good. And in Scotland, there was a mood of optimism, around the fact that there was possibility. There was a Scottish government that was buoyant, appeared to be in control of its own fortunes, was making an argument as to how to go forward, had presented the case for a referendum. And confidence is absolutely fundamental to economic well-being. Keynes, Lord Keynes, J.M. Keynes, whichever way you want to put it, he described this as the animal spirits of people that drove the economy. And I think those animal spirits were quite high in 2014. Where are they now? They are definitely not high. Whatever happened in 2014 with regard to the referendum, and, I think we can all remember a certain sinking feeling at getting the result. We then went on to the disaster of 2016 and Brexit and all the consequences that have flowed from that ever since. And it's been a drip feed of decline. And, look at just the fall in the value of the pound since then, and you'll see what's gone on in many ways. And then we got to 2020. And of course, we had COVID, and we had the Bank of England intervening totally appropriately, doing QE. But afterwards, we had inflation, which was not created by any domestic situation. And we have since then seen the Bank of England at its very worst. So apart from all the consequences as well of war in Ukraine and the fact that we now know that 10 years has elapsed with regard to climate change and nothing has really happened, we were still relatively optimistic a decade ago because we had a decade in hand, and now we've got almost no time in hand. All of those things, suddenly it's disastrous. We have low exchange rate, high interest rate, low confidence, austerity too being offered by Labour in almost unbridled enthusiasm by Starmer and Reeves. It's a very, very different place. 2014 wasn't great, don't get me wrong. There were very good reasons why people in Scotland wanted out of the UK in 2014. But God, it's worse now.
Yeah.
Karen, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, so in 2014, actually, I was still doing my degree, and it was a huge time of hope, obviously, with the referendum. But then soon after, 2 years later, came Brexit. And, that was a big shock, I think, most especially for people in Scotland. I think we were in a bit of a bubble here. And we certainly didn't expect to be thrown into that situation. And it was very distressing. And, obviously it has been very destructive for our economy as well. I think the other things that occur to me are the loss of trust in politicians. I think the Conservatives have a lot to answer for, so does Donald Trump. And, that's really corrosive for our society. I think everyone's aware after the pandemic, much more aware of the inequality in our society, which is adding to that distrust. I think huge swathes of people are very aware of the ecological crisis that's coming down the line as well. So there's a lot of worry and discontent, and I don't see Westminster really doing enough to assuage people's fears in any of these respects.
Much to agree with there.
Yeah. And when we look at the kind of macroeconomic indicators of 2014 to where we are now, unemployment's a little bit lower percentage-wise, but a lot of the jobs are much worse than they were now to 2014. Inflation now is round about the same where it is. We've had that drop off, and we've had that not devaluation, but a lower value of the pound. The economy as a whole doesn't seem dramatically different. But what strikes me, Richard and Karen, is how people feel that idea of confidence, but also the impact of a real stagnant real wages and increasing in utilities and the cost of living. So I just wonder if you could Richard, first of all, if you could talk to that. That's the economy, which we always talk about, but it's meaningless compared to how people are feeling and what the impact of their finances and how they're feeling 10 years on.
We keep on, let's just explore some of those issues. It's very clear that inequality has risen over the last decade. Absolutely unambiguously. The rich are richer. I've done work on this. It was in the Taxing Wealth report that I wrote, and if you want to have a look at it, that's available at a website called Taxing Wealth Report. Just taxingwealth.uk it's called. So you can find that report there, and there's a lot of background data on how inequality rose. And the rich have got richer, but nobody else has. But there's much more insecurity when there's been the rise of the gig economy. But that's extended all over the place because, for example, I now know a lot of graduates are having real problems despite getting good degrees. And I know all the debate about grade inflation and all that nonsense, but these people are well qualified, having real problems getting work. I'm involved in a university. I know a little bit about this. There is a lack of confidence around buying a home because, let's be blunt, the difficulty of buying homes has increased. And over the last decade, we have seen, and I know there have been changes which are different in Scotland from the rest of the UK, and thank God for that. But it has been a situation where rents have got more difficult. People are desperate to find somewhere to live. The proportion of income being paid out in rents has risen. Rental inflation has been above normal inflation. Over this period, we've seen for the first time a measurement made as a consequence of what the impact of inflation on those on low incomes as compared to those generally is. And we know that inflation has been worse on those on low incomes. In other words, the people who are in the most precarious positions in society over the last decade have got worse. But as much as that's true, and that's pretty serious, many more people feel as though the prospect of moving into a precarious situation has grown as well. For example, all of those who were on fixed rate mortgages, who thought they were on a pretty good deal and who could afford the mortgages when they took out a purchase on a house, whatever, suddenly discovered they were going to pay twice as much or more, and had no idea how to find hundreds of pounds extra a month out of a budget that was already pushed to the limits, as far as they were concerned. And in many cases, genuinely was pushed to the limits, not meeting any frivolities, but literally the cost of living. And so this feeling that we are only a short step away from risk has grown in vast numbers of households. And I think that, to me, is the biggest change. I became an old age pensioner this year. I look back in a different way, perhaps. I look back over a longer period of time now than I realize most people do. I find that slightly odd. I mean, I don't actually feel as though I'm 66, but I am. And I can look back until, you know, the 1970s with ease now. And there's such a difference in confidence between now and, say, 50 years ago. But when I look at where has that process of change taken place the most, is very recently. I don't think before the 2008 financial crisis there was any sense of precariousness to the degree there is now. And now I think it's commonplace. And that's what worries me most, because people who are worried don't spend. People who are worried are more sick, both physically and with regard to mental well-being. And I think that there is a real problem with mental well-being. It's growing amongst younger people. We know that's true. Rates of neurodivergence, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being neurodivergent, are growing. I say that because I'm probably neurodivergent myself, I've realized. And I'm not worried about it, but it makes life for some people more difficult. And I think that this is, again, all part of the conflict between a stereotype that is put forward by a neoliberal society and reinforced by endless television and other media advertising that says there is a life you should aspire to, which very many people don't even vaguely recognize. And that stress is becoming not yet unsustainable, perhaps, although for some it clearly is, but increasingly, I think it is more generally becoming unsustainable. And that's the massive difference that we're seeing everywhere. Doesn't matter where you are, this feeling of disquiet about the way the economy is growing. And this is not just down to any one of the factors we've already mentioned and Karen's already mentioned. You know, these things Karen's already mentioned, these things are much deeper. They're in our psyche, almost in our souls, that we know that the state isn't there to protect us anymore. And when we see a Labour government come in, and what does it first do? Say, oh, we're going to keep the 2-child poverty limit in England, therefore we're going to leave children vulnerable. And you think, what? This is Labour? And then they take away the winter fuel payments, described differently in England and Wales from Scotland, but fundamentally similar payments. And they make sure that they're taken away, and they basically override the devolution settlement to make sure that Scotland loses it. Then you think, where on earth is this government going, and what are its priorities? Because it seems that the most vulnerable people in society are its targets. And that makes everyone feel a little bit edgy, I think. And I've heard so many conversations about that, taken part in so many conversations about that. It really worries me.
Yeah, and that's really enlightening. And I think if we look back 10 years and we say that a Labour government would get in and these are the types of things that it would do, you know, I think a lot of people just 6 months ago didn't think this would happen. So we certainly didn't think that 10 years ago. Karen, any thoughts on those other kind of big issues and the reasons we feel in this the way that we do before we move on?
Yeah, I think we have a crisis of redistribution. You know, I mean, for both parties in Scotland and in the UK, you know, there's this constant going on about growth. And we know we can't keep growing. It's really about redistribution. And to be fair to the Scottish government, they, you know, have more tax bands. They are working on that to the extent that they can. I think what I also feel now is that devolution is a busted flush.
Yes.
The fact that two big policies that were voted on and passed by all the politicians in Holyrood have just been knocked back by Westminster, it makes us feel that our devolution is just power that's on loan. It's not really real power. I think also the Grenfell tragedy that's come to the fore recently. Ian Dunt put it really succinctly. Grenfell is the tombstone to neoliberalism. It literally is there as a big symbol in the middle of London. It is the tombstone to neoliberalism. Anyone who thinks that, you know, deregulation is a good thing just needs to look at that. And as I was talking to you about this last time as well, it's not just that all those people died a horrible death in that situation. It's also left thousands of people who are in homes that they can't move out of. They're maybe in a 1-bedroom flat. They can't have a family because they can't move out of their 1-bedroom flat. You know, it's such a stupid way to run a country. Then there's the whole infrastructure, the railway line that has spent so much money to get the land to build. That's not happened. Then they were going to build the railway lines between the north towns in England. That's not happened either. It feels as if the British government just is incapable. It feels like it's incapable. So what are they for? And people are just going to keep rebelling and be angry unless the government can prove that it has power and it can do things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I just want to move on, Richard, just to kind of say that at some point I'd like to touch on the kind of political impact of the economy being in such a mess. And I think that's how I would like to kind of finish. But I just want to talk about, we've said all of these problems and we're going back to 2014 and we think, right, if Scotland would have voted yes, what would the difference be, right? But I don't want to go into the details. I just kind of want to touch on, actually, Richard, Scotland independent, right? Scotland not independent. Does that really matter that much in terms of the economic performance? When you think about the things that affect the Scottish economy, would it have been... what is it that affects the Scottish economy? Because it's certainly not the Scottish government putting out strategy papers, right? What is it that improves our GDP or improves our well-being? What are the big things that impact our economy, where we're independent or not?
Well, let's just stand back and say, suppose there had been yes, Scotland would not have left Europe for a start. Let's be clear, Brexit would not have happened as far as Scotland was concerned. So Scotland would still be inside the European Union and would be enjoying the benefits of that. Scotland would also therefore have not seen a fall in the value of its currency, which would not have been the pound, I hope. An argument we can go over time and again, but I really would have hoped that by 2016, the Scottish currency was not the pound and it would not have seen the fall in the value of the currency that has happened since Brexit in the rest of the UK. So Scotland
that was not the proposal that people were voting on. People were voting on sterlingization, remember? So we would have had, if we're kind of playing these what if games, all we can go on is what the Scottish government's proposal was, and it was we would still have the pound.
Well, if would there be a pound, then there would. But let's also be clear: even if it had the pound, Scotland would have been in a stronger trading position than Britain because it would not have been suffering the competitive barriers that the rest of the UK had. I personally think it would actually have hurried up and got rid of the pound because of what had happened on Brexit. I think that would have provided the incentive to actually make the change. Now, I can only speculate there, but I believe that would have happened quickly. And if it had, Scotland would now be in an even stronger trading position. And in fact, the value of the Scottish pound might be, and we can talk about that quite reasonably. It's after all 8 years since Brexit. That's a long time. You can make change in that period. Scotland could have had its own currency, and that currency could well be worth more than the British pound, therefore giving Scotland a strength in a sense, and also a reduced inflation rate. Scotland would also have had a reduced inflation rate because it would have been more energy independent than it is as part of the UK. Clearly, Scotland has a degree of energy independence, which is quite unlike the rest of the UK, whether it's with regard to oil and gas or whether it's with regard to renewable energy, which is incredibly strong. Scotland could have been in the position of actually managing the process of change and investing in those industries like renewables earlier than it would otherwise have done. It could have been tackling some of these other issues of inequality, for example, by changing the tax system. I believe that a Scottish government would, over the last decade, have actually said, we need to tackle inequality in Scotland. It's a major issue. We know that it is particularly difficult in Scotland. We know there are issues around land, for example, which could have been tackled in different ways if only we had been seeing Scotland with its own powers. We would have seen the ability to change the taxation rates on investment income and on capital gains and on corporation tax and so on. And I believe that Scotland would have done that to reinforce a policy of positive redistribution. Do I think that would have had an impact? Yes. Do I think it would have tackled inequality? Yes. Do I think it would have relieved child poverty? Yes. Do I think pensioners would have been better off because Scotland could have had a stronger pound. Yes, I do actually think they might have been better off as a consequence. Do I think that Scotland would have suffered the same cost of living crisis because I think that the impact of inflation would have been lower? Yes, I do, because it was throughout much of continental Europe, and Scotland would have looked more like a European economy than it would have looked like a UK economy as a consequence. And therefore, interest rates, for example, wouldn't have risen so much. So people with mortgages would be better off as a result, because we've seen that in the impact of the Eurozone. So do I believe that Scotland could have got through this period stronger, more confident, better prepared for what is happening now? Yes, overall I do. I think that there would have been many strengths that would have arisen for Scotland, that it would have been able to manage better as an independent country than it has been able to, well, suffer as part of the UK.
Fantastic. Right. Well, Kieran, we'll see what you think, because I'm going to put a slightly alternative view to that question. But Kieran, what's your thoughts? So let's kind of dive in then. My question to Richard was, what kind of impacts the Scottish economy? And Richard was saying, with independence, we would have been able to make a big difference. So what's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so let's talk about real independence, and that we had our own central bank set up after a short amount of time, and that we obviously in 2016 our neighbour to the south decided that it would come out of Europe. We would have been in a situation, because we become independent, we would have come out of Europe as well, but we'd be 2 years towards rejoining again, which is what I think the majority of people it is. We've seen that from the referendum. The majority of people in Scotland want to rejoin the EU. I think there would be mass rejection of neoliberalism. We haven't voted Tory since 1955, and even then that was when the Conservatives were building houses. We could have attracted immigration.
Yes.
So this is the big thing. We need more people. We could have attracted immigration. We could have a taxation system that suits our particular demographics and our particular geography as well, which is very varied. We have these huge conurbations in the Central Belt and a sparse population around the rest of Scotland. Those demographics and geography demand a different taxation system. Our universities, for me in Aberdeen, we're losing our languages in our universities because we're not adjoined to Europe anymore. So it's not interesting for people to learn French or learn German. This is a tragedy as far as I'm concerned. Having a second language or a third language, these are really important things for people to learn. And I think that we could have tackled climate change in our own way and much more successfully. Absolutely, we could have done all of those things as an independent country.
Okay, great. I'd love to hear what you all think. I like all the coulds and the maybes, and because we've got no idea. And I think it's great to hear both of you, looking back. My position is that looking at the perspective that we were voting on in 2014, it was solidly neoliberal. And this idea that we became independent and we rejected neoliberalism, I don't think holds much water. I think the government that we would have elected or would have taken us through that process was solidly neoliberal. And I think the evidence of how the Scottish government has acted, even when it's had elements of control, has shown you that it's still purely centrally fixed on this idea of foreign investment and growth and neoliberalism and capitalism. So I don't think we would have had anywhere near these changes that we would have. And I think the fundamental thing for us going forward is to realize that we have to change the institutions. And you both remember the prospectus was all about grandfathering all the regulation, and bringing that all from London and starting it from there. And maybe 10 years on, things may have changed, but I think the pace of change would have been so much slower. And without a fundamental view and change of how we structure our policies in Scotland, not much would have changed. Richard, you're scowling at me, which is what I like to see. What's your response to that?
I am scowling at you, and the reason why I'm scowling at you is that you're assuming that there would have been an Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon style SNP government controlling the government of Scotland since the time of independence, which would, of course, have taken a while to have achieved. And I accept all the points you've made about the fact that there would have been the transition, etc. But I don't know that the SNP would necessarily have survived as a single political party much after a referendum. I think there was a very real chance that it was split. And I think that will happen whenever independence happens in Scotland, because I think the SNP, as my observations suggest, is an uncomfortable coalition on occasions, and that the capacity to split is there, and in fact would be welcome if it was there, to be honest. And I think that there would have been a very different Scottish Labour Party, I could hope, and maybe with different people in charge, I could hope, because some of those people I don't find particularly attractive in political terms at present. But I think that there would have been a change in the Scottish political narrative, in other words. I don't think you can assume that this cohesion, which still sort of exists around the SNP, despite all its problems at the moment, as the only place where you can reasonably put your vote if you want Scotland to be independent, would have survived independence. And that's why I don't think that your assumption there that the SNP would have got its way with all its plans as per the 2014 agenda is necessarily a good one. 10 years after, I think it would actually might well have been a bad one. I think it would clearly have won an immediate post-referendum general election for Scotland. But I don't know by now. And I think that Scotland is also quite open to the idea that coalition is the name of the game. And I would rather have hoped that Scotland would not have put first past the post into play the immediate aftermath of an independence referendum, but would have maintained some form of proportional electoral system that would have made it harder for the SNP to be able to control and would have allowed others to have more influence. So I don't buy all your arguments there, William. I think we would have seen a more progressive Scotland emerging once independence had happened.
Yeah, I think this is when we're talking about the assumptions, isn't it? And it's the importance of assumptions in economic conversations, because you have to make certain assumptions and then build your narrative and your story on it. And Richard and I are starting from two very different positions. I would say SNP winning with their perspective would give them all the headway to implement that perspective. The fact that they'd won an independence campaign would have given them a lot of political capital that would have taken them at least past that first election. I think there'd be in 2020s with a government who are doing all the same things that we're doing now, possibly even worse, considering their absolute drug need for an investment. If we still had the Bank of England, as was per the proposal in 2014, and pound, we would be in a terrible state. If we were trying to join Europe, we would have the same fiscal rules in Europe that we have now. So the idea of us spending any more than 3% of our deficit and 60% of our debt wouldn't be happening. We'd still be facing austerity. So this is where my argument comes from, and who knows, Richard? That's the wonderful thing. Karen, you can decide. You're the third person. I want a quick answer, and then I'm going to bring in some of the comments and questions from the audience.
Yeah. I guess I would say that I think that you think that the Scottish population would maybe be a little bit too supine, and I find them curious. And certainly during the referendum, I had many conversations at bus stops and buses and in lots of random places with people. People were so engaged, and I think that if we'd won, it would have been massive engagement, even more. I think it would have rejuvenated our country, and also in an intellectual way as well. The other thing as well, what's being called for now is a lot more localism, so that devolution right down to councils as well. So that's really desired. People want that. I think when it comes to what the SNP were offering at that time, I think it would have become very apparent very quickly that they had to set up their own central bank and their own currency really pronto. I think so. Even though maybe Salmond was promulgating that idea at the time, I think it would have become really obvious very quickly that they had to just backtrack on that completely,
I think there's a really interesting point you make there, Karen. And it's just how flipping enormous Scotland is geographically. In proportion to the number of people, this is a big country. And that there are very big regional differences. I'm pretty unusual living in England to have actually been to Scotland. I'm even more unusual that I've been to every council in Scotland, and I only miss out in terms of visiting places pretty much Orkney and Shetland, which I admit have never yet seen my presence. And I sincerely hope at some time they will. But otherwise, I've pretty much been there, and it's deliberate. I enjoy visiting places. And the differences in Scotland are in many ways more stark. Whether you're comparing, right down in the southwest in Port Patrick or somewhere to where you are in the northeast, Karen, or up into the northwest, and the central belt standing almost apart from everywhere else. The need for regional policy in Scotland would be significant. And I do think there would have been a demand for devolution. And I don't think that any Holyrood government would have been able to withstand that demand, because I think it would really have been significant. The appetite for change in Scotland, once it had actually liberated itself, would, I think, have been enormous. You see this when somebody leaves home. Suddenly, they'll go and try out all sorts of things. Some of them they shouldn't have tried. Scotland would have wanted to taste what freedom felt like. They would not necessarily have rewarded the SNP even. It's a bit like, Churchill won the war, and what did the people of the UK do to him after he won the war? They kicked him out of office. They wanted something different. And I think it would have been that spirit which would have pervaded an independent Scotland very quickly. But I may be wrong.
Brilliant. Well, I've got a few comments and questions here. So let's do some quick answers. And again, here's another theoretical. Thanks, Hashbury. Would England have voted to leave the EU if Scotland had already voted for independence? I like that one. That's a good what if. Richard, would England still have left?
Oh yes.
Yes. Karen?
Yeah.
Oh, again, I would say I have no idea, because I'm in the Scottish bubble. I wouldn't know. I really wouldn't know.
Can I be clear about something?
I have a better idea, yeah.
Most people in England know nothing about Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't listen to Scottish opinion. I've actually had a person tell me, you Scots should be really lucky that you're allowed to have members of parliament. Just be grateful. And I just think that's amazing. But I've actually been told that. Do I think it would have made any difference? No, none at all. They'd have voted for independence.
Here's a very quick one for you, right? Can you name me a Scottish economic commentator that you've seen on any mainstream UK channel? Not Scottish channel, but when's the last economic commentator from Scotland who's been on Question Time or Newsnight? Scotland is just allowed to exist on its own little bubble, and those voices are not amplified in any way by the UK. Ponder on that. They've got another couple of questions here.
I've got an answer for you.
Go for it.
Well, the person who has probably been on things is Gordon Brown, but does he really qualify? But that would be it. Come on, he's a national figure, an actual Scottish figure. I'm struggling. Obviously, debate night's different, but even then, I've been on debate night. I've been dragged up to do it.
It's just there's a lack of, not just in the economic, which is obviously what I see, but in the cultural as well. It really is a kind of, and I always think that independence would have given us so much more impetus for our kind of cultural reawakening. And I think if we were having a discussion about that, much more evidence base for us to be so much more engaged and moving forward on that than there was on the economy.
You raise a massively important point, and that is the cultural suppression of Scotland within the UK. But I would also add the same for the Welsh. I mean, it's exactly the same. You never hear anybody representing Wales either. So there is this English-centric view of the world, which is projected by the BBC in particular. Let's not talk about the BBC in Scotland tonight, because that will just upset everyone.
Yes, it will. Right, and we've got another comment from Wifpet here. Yeah, right. Can you see that comment on screen, Karen? I'll just remove it. Then.
I'm just going to point out that Miriam Brett from Future Economy Scotland was actually in Question Time. So
she has been. True, and she's very good as well.
She is very good. Thanks for that one. Okay, we had a comment there, Richard. The SNP would not have been in charge or even coexist. So I think that comment's backing your point of view about what would have happened to the SNP post independence. We've got another comment here. We could do with more of these points being made on more platforms and regularly, even if what's... Yes, I agree with you completely. I think these discussions are really, really important, and it would be interesting to see what our media is going to do with independence 10 years on, because I haven't seen much at the moment.
Well, can I just point out to that viewer about the Scottish Currency Group conference? That's going to be also filmed as well. So there'll be lots of those types of conversations going on there, I'm sure.
And that's next week, not this coming weekend, the weekend after.
Correct.
So that's well worth having a look in on.
Yeah, the final comment I wanted to make was that Scotland is a small economy, and over the last 10 years, all of the impacts of COVID, Brexit, if that would have happened, the war in Ukraine, the ecological crisis, the cost of living crisis, we've got to remember that this little small part of a small island has only got so much kind of sway, and likely our GDP, if you wanted to use that, would likely be exactly the same as it was within the United Kingdom, because right now our GDP tracks almost one-to-one with what happens in the United Kingdom. And if there's a recession in Europe, our economy doesn't grow. If there's a global recession, our economy doesn't grow. So I think it's really important that people realize that independence might be this opportunity for us to do loads of things so differently, but internally there can be a lot of changes. But when we're looking at things like GDP, for example, economic growth, those are the things that I don't think will be particularly influenced whether we're independent or not. Well-being and resilience, and having much more democracy and devolving all of our decisions. These are all the things that I think would happen in an independent Scotland. In no way am I saying it's a bad idea. I'm just looking back over that 10 years. Richard, you got another comment?
Yeah, of course. Sorry. But first of all, I don't accept the idea that Scotland is a small economy. Iceland is. But I don't accept that Scotland, when compared to a country like Denmark, for example, is small, because Denmark is about the same size. Is Ireland...
It's like 0.5% of the global economy, the Scottish economy.
Look, I entirely agree. But
global economy.
Yeah, look, I'm not pretending that in those technical terms that economists love to use about small open economies, Scotland would be a small open economy, and therefore its ability to trade and its ability to maintain a currency and a balance of trading surplus or deficit that was manageable, and all those other things would be of significance, because they are. But that's true for would have been true for the rest of the UK. It's true for all countries. But if you look in EU terms, Scotland is actually in the middle of the ordering of countries by size. Now, of course, there are some massive countries on that scale. There's Germany, there's France, there's Spain, there's Italy. But there's a lot of small countries there as well. And, they are surviving and their GDPs are okay, presuming that we actually want to measure well-being by GDP. And I think that one of the things that actually would have begun to develop, and I think Scotland should have begun to develop, and which I think the Scottish government should be developing even now, is an appraisal of what is the quality of life in Scotland. Because this measure of GDP, pounds per buck, is useless. As I keep on pointing out to people, 10% of GDP in the whole of the UK is made up of the notional rent that owner-occupiers pay for themselves for the right to live in their own houses. Well, there's a technical description for that. It's a load of old bollocks, and I apologize if that offends people, but it's a made-up number. And I would also quote Robert Kennedy. I can remember Robert Kennedy being killed. I'm old enough to actually know where I was when I heard of his death in 1968. I was 10. And he said, just before he died, about GDP, it measures everything except those things that are really important to us as human beings. And I believe that Scotland actually can probably, or would be able to, if it was independent, lead a path towards a better standard of living, a well-being economy, without necessarily having to massively change its GDP, because it would have that sense of identity. And when you look at people the thing that is most able to differentiate people who are happy from those who are not is having a confidence in their own identity. And Scotland hasn't got that confidence at present because it knows, and you said it earlier in this, Karen, we're being sat upon by and lent independence in Scotland from England. And that's not okay. And I believe that if only Scotland had that sense of identity, well-being would rise whether or not GDP made a big difference, as well as, and I believe this, and Karen and I on the same side here, there would have been more redistribution. And that's absolutely critical.
Well, it's such a powerful message there, Richard. Karen, do you want to sum up, and then we'll move on to another few questions? Any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think absolutely we would reject. We'd have the opportunity to reject the cult of GDP measurement. It is a cult. It does feels like a cult to me. And we should be measuring what's important. And I think, working class people, and Mark made this point, Mark Blythe, about an interview in Sunderland where a guy there said, who's GDP? It doesn't matter for him whether the pie gets bigger or we're going to have more growth. The redistribution hasn't happened, and it's been going the wrong way since the 1980s. So, working class people don't care about the growth of the pie. It's really the people that in the higher echelons of politics, they want to make the pie bigger. But we know on an ecological level that that's a nonsense. They need to step away from that, and they need to do redistribution. And as I say, Scottish government have done a bit towards that, as much as they probably can. The British government needs to do that now. And, the example of the fuel payment that's happened, there's something on a regional level that you absolutely cannot do the same thing in England as in Scotland, because sometimes you're talking about a 17-degree difference in temperature.
Well, I think we're all going to agree on GDP, but I'm going to come back and say Scotland right now has the SNP has won all the elections in Scotland since the referendum. They have clearly got a very strong growth narrative and a neoliberal narrative, and they keep winning elections in Scotland. So this idea that we're all just there waiting for a party who disowns GDP, there's no evidence of that. And I don't think there's any evidence over this period of time we would have had a type of government that you both think happened. I think the key word for me is could. And I think if we're looking back, all these things could have happened. But my work on this kind of policy paradigm is just to look at that and say, what would have changed? And that's the question now I'll ask you, Richard. What changes do we need if you want to see that kind of how things could have worked 10 years ago? If Scotland becomes independent, let's say 2030, what type of changes to the institutions do we need? What real meaningful things can people look at and say, yep, that institution, be a formal institution like a central bank or an institution like the energy market, what things need to change for us to have a very different type of economy than we've had over the last 10 years? And I know that's a big question, so if you just want to kind of pick a couple of things, that would be great.
Well, there's two immediate ones I pick on. One is that Scotland would obviously need its own central bank because it's going to need its own currency, and it's going to need it as fast as possible after independence, because the pound is not something that anybody would want to be pegged to, because it's too vulnerable to being blown around by the whims of Nigel Farage and whatever other form of a referendum or pressure he comes up with. And he's there and he's real, and there isn't any equivalent in Scotland. The other thing that's absolutely critical that Scotland has is its own tax authority with its own imagination. I've written a couple of papers on this, one for Commonweal, one later, and I've explored the idea that Scotland needs to have a totally different approach to taxation, and I think many people would agree to this. And it's not just about the need for different taxes, but it's a different approach to tax to actually involve people in the thinking. And I would say that's exactly the same with regard to a Scottish central bank. We wouldn't want a whole pile of academics drawn from all over the world to come to Edinburgh every now and again and pontificate on what the interest rate should be. We should actually have a Scottish central bank which is tasked with maintaining full employment, which is tasked with well-being, which is tasked with environmental change and maintaining investment and reducing inequality. And actually controlling inflation is a sort of an epiphenomenon that falls out of that. But anyway, inflation is a temporary epiphenomenon which arises as a consequence of international shocks, all of which invariably are exacerbated by the stupidity of world current financial markets, and which dissipate very quickly anyway, as data since 1210, and I do mean that's 1210 AD, not 10 past noon today, is available, which shows that inflation always passes very quickly. So to have inflation as the priority for running an economy is absolutely absurd. All those other things are much more important. Absolutely. What also I think we would need as an institutional change in Scotland, and I'm going to throw this one back at you again, William, and this is for a good reason. We actually would need to see the rise of non-neoliberal parties in Scotland, because, and I have written a column for The National, which as far as I can see isn't out today, but if it is, someone let me know. And you will see that it's a comparison between Labour and the SNP when it comes out. And I say that actually what's really shocking is how similar they are. They're not that dissimilar, because A, you can't work out what the policy of the SNP about creating a pathway to independence is. And look, I'm not criticizing the membership. Most of the membership can work out a pathway. They know what they want to achieve. But when you get to the leadership, it's not clear what they mean. And both these parties, as you said, William, are definitely neoliberal to their core at their leadership levels, not at their local levels, not at their membership levels. Same as I know that, you know, every Labour Party I ever talked to, and I've talked to quite a lot of constituency Labour parties, are full of people who appear to be firmly left of centre, and yet we have a very obviously right of centre Labour government at present. So we do need to see the rise of alternative thinking. And I happen to believe, in this sense, that the shock that the SNP is going through at present is probably, in the long run, going to be important, because it's going to force it to define what the heck the SNP is actually about again, and how is it going to achieve its core objective of independence again, which it has lost its path on. And those two things are absolutely vital. And I'm sure I'll upset some people by saying this. You know, this back puts me in the same camp as somebody like Robin McAlpine for saying, you know, the SNP needs to get its act together. And, you know, I'm sorry if I do offend people, but actually as an observer, and that's what I play a role as, this is what I see. I see a party that needs to rejuvenate, rethink, and repurpose itself. If that happens, and I almost make that a precondition of it happening, that's where we have to go.
Okay, fantastic. Kieran, your thoughts on what needs to change for, if we become independent, what needs to change for us to see this type of economy that the three of us want, and we think the most people in Scotland. Richard said the kind of institutions of central bank having completely different mandates, and the importance of our currency are two kind of fundamental differences. Any thoughts from you? And then I'll bring it in.
Becoming an independent country again in the world today means that we've got lots and lots of templates to look at and say, well, what do we like and what do we not like? You know, and for a start, setting up our central bank is the first bit of infrastructure that we need to have. And we're going to discuss that in 2 weeks' time with lots of people. And we can look at what do we like, what do we want it to be independent? I would argue no. But you know that there are downsides to it not being independent as well. So how do you control the downsides of that? So you know, going forward, that we've got these templates and we can just use them. Coming back to the party, the SNP, you know, for a long time it was the only show in town. Alba has come up, but it's not getting anywhere. I think what a lot of independence people felt up to this election, I would argue, is that you have to go with the SNP because it is the representation in Westminster of independence for Scotland. You know, it is the representation. But Richard's right. The leadership need to be clear about what their path, what they see the path is to actually getting towards independence. They have to be much clearer about that going forward.
And what the benefits of it are. Because they're not selling that. And I think we're discussing that tonight, and I hope we are, and we don't necessarily agree with each other, but that debate is really important. And to me, that's not being discussed enough. I don't see that. And I take part in quite a lot of, you know, and I try to stay in touch with a lot of Scottish thinking.
You're not reading my articles in the National, though, because we're doing a lot of work on what the vision should be.
No, I do read your articles.
But yeah, I'm not
hearing that. More broadly, I'm not hearing that being sold.
I'm going to give this, and I'm going to just kind of show this again, and I know some of the audience will have seen it. And this is my kind of UK's austerity paradigm. And what I'm saying is that I think in general, if if we want to move to a type of an economy that we all think, then this is the type of paradigm that our new government has to adopt. And you'll see how, you'll see that it has to move away from all of these things. And this is what I mean about when I'm talking about the institutional change. So we have to stop thinking of the primacy of the market. We need to think about other ways to change the economy that's not just moving prices up and down. We need to realize that growth for the sake of it isn't good. These are the type of institutional changes I'm kind of trying to, get to. We need to move away from this idea that markets will solve anything. And I know you're incredibly busy, Richard, but if you want to spend 20 minutes looking at the Green Strategy paper that the Scottish Government wrote yesterday, and just think, has this been written by a party that is not being captured? I would love to hear your results of that, because it really is one of the most neoliberal bits of documents I've ever seen, and this is shocking coming from the Scottish Government, especially when they don't have any of these macroeconomic powers. But I want to bring a few of our comments in, because we've had loads. So thanks very much. We've got some kind of technology stuff here. So that's for the things that we could do a little bit differently. We've got some comments on our reserves. I think we've got citizen assemblies, and this really talks to the idea that we spoke about at the start, which maybe we'll return to now, about politics and democracy in a new Scotland. So let's I'll go through I'll pull out some other comments. We've got about 10 minutes left, but the politics of where we are and in the United Kingdom at the moment. And I just kind of like to say, firstly to you, Karen, what happens if we don't get independent and Scotland stays part of this United Kingdom, and we have a Labour government that continually seems to move further to the right and adopting this austerity? What happens in 4 or 5 years' time? 2030, there's another general election. What can you see?
Well, it's not a good picture. I mean, what I can see with this winter fuel payment is that a substantial amount of pensioners are going to die. That's going to put a massive strain on the National Health Service. I have a colleague who's a counsellor. He's also a paramedic as well. He's literally picked people out of their houses, taken them to hospital to warm them up, because they have, when people become older, their temperature, they don't feel that they're getting cold, and then they become hypothermic. And so that's going to put massive stress on the NHS. So people are going to die. And also our population, it's not going to grow unless we can get more immigration. So, there has to be, I'm hoping that GB Energy will come to Aberdeen. The document, the bill for it is 4 pages. I'm not hopeful for that. There's been an actual plan for it to actually happen. They've had X amount of years in the wilderness, but there doesn't seem to be a great plan for this. So I'm hopeful they'll do it, but I just don't see it. So I'm not feeling hopeful without independence.
Richard, what's your thoughts? And again, I think it's great having your view from down south as well.
I'm pretty despondent about what is happening. Anybody who reads my blog will know that I'm not exactly jumping up and down with excitement about the way in which this government is going. The winter fuel allowance, the 2-child poverty cap, and so on, all indications of some extremely strange thinking. But also I'm worried about other things. For example, today's announcement, and I know the NHS in Scotland is obviously different from the NHS in England and Wales, though you would not know that. Indeed, England and Wales, and they are different again, but you wouldn't know that from what we saw from our Prime Minister today, who seems to be talking for the whole of the UK, but isn't, of course. Some very, very weird thinking. I will give funds to the NHS if it reforms first. You mean you're blaming the staff in the NHS for the fact they were underfunded by the Tories, and now they've got to put it right before you'll give them the resources to do it? This is just bizarre economic thinking and management. I was pretty worried about Lisa Nandy as well, with her comments about the future of the BBC. Now, again, I make it clear. I mean, there are a lot of people in Scotland who really aren't fans of the BBC, and there are a lot of people in England who really aren't fans of the BBC as well. But the discussion of mutualisation, I thought, was really interesting from Labour, because that is, we'll give every licence payer a share in the NHS. And then you can see what will happen. Well, nobody's going to put any value on this share until sometime Murdoch or somebody comes along and says, I'll give you a couple of years of free television in exchange for your share, and everybody will start selling to them. And suddenly we've privatized it by the back door. So mutualization is just a back door to privatization. And what do I see being mutualized next? Well, the NHS, very obviously. It's your NHS. It's your company. Oh dear, you've just sold it. And I think that there is this deep neoliberal culture, which is incredibly dangerous. The whole idea that the winter fuel allowance is suddenly being means tested is again a backdoor. I think it is only time before the old age pension is means tested. I think that this universal benefit on which so many people have relied will suddenly become a means tested benefit. Now, there are people who can do without an old age pension. They can survive in their old age without it. But I know very few people who do not think it's a significant part of their pension planning. You've got to be very wealthy to actually be able to ignore the fact that you get $11,500 a year if you are my age as a pensioner, and say that's of inconsequence when you look at your future plans, because it isn't of inconsequence. But suppose it is made means tested. All of this scares me rigid. I heard Steve Baker of the Tories say, 20 years' time, we won't have a welfare state. We won't be able to afford it. Steve Baker was a Tory MP until, of course, July. And why can't we afford it if we have a country in the future which at least has the same income as now? Well, the only reason I can explain that is that he thinks we'll be paying so much in interest to the wealthy on the apparent level of debt that he thinks will be incurred that we won't be able to actually support people with a welfare state. So we will have a whole system which will be designed to upwards redistribute and ignore the consequences. We are living in incredibly dangerous times, and neoliberalism, which is being endorsed by the Tories, by the Liberal Democrats, by Labour, and by a lot of the SNP's leadership, is the threat. And it's a common threat. On my blog, we call it the single transferable party now. You don't actually get a vote in an election. You just choose which colour you want to attach to the mast, who are currently going to have their go at delivering the same sort of policy. I read about this in 2011 in a book called The Courageous State. I said that neoliberal politicians were already at that time beginning to abandon responsibility for decisions and leaving them to the market. And since then, the situation has got much, much, much worse. Yeah. And I think that's the big threat we face. And I think it's true in Scotland. I think it's true in the UK. And I see a greater chance of Scotland breaking away from that mold as an independent country than I do by being inside England and the rest of the UK at present. I don't see the UK surviving. I don't think the Welsh will put up with this for much longer either, by the way. And Northern Ireland is going to tip over. The balance is clearly going to change just purely in population terms. That there will be a border vote at some time. There's nothing we can stop about that. And therefore, I do see major change. And Scotland is going to actually have to reflect that fact. We are going to live through what the Chinese would call interesting times, which means turbulent periods. Climate change is going to be part of that. But the failure of what I said, this single transferable party, the neoliberal cult, is going to pose massive threats to us.
Absolutely. Right, Richard, I want to thank you so much for that. I just want to kind of, what I'm kind of pushing towards is this, that it's really clear. You've already got people like Nigel Farage saying that we shouldn't be taking money off pensioners. The right is already weaponizing what the central parties are doing to get more votes. And this is what happens when you have a central party which is not brave and bold enough to make these types of decisions. It's that everything pushes to the right and we end up with fascist states. And this is what Clara Matti covers in a lot of detail on what happened with Mussolini in Italy and the amount of support that he got, not just within Italy from the establishment, but from within the United Kingdom, by seen as being a person who was strong and was able to hold an economy together and was able to ensure that profits were paid. This is what happens when we have an economy that doesn't provide for everyone. It moves to the right and we end up with fascist dictators. And
that book is well worth reading, really well worth reading.
Wonderful book. Well, right, everyone, we've got a minute. I'm going to just bring up some of your comments. I'd like it, Richard or Kieran, just to comment in any of these.
Keir Starmer, I don't know what Keir Starmer's about. I just saw somebody say, what is he about? I don't know. Seems to have no moral compass at all. Right-wing think tanks are fully responsible for today's situation. Well, yes, But let's be totally honest, I'm not too enamored by most of the supposedly left-wing think tanks right now. IPPR has just downloaded all its people into Downing Street, and they appear to be doing some pretty appalling things. And they're supposedly a left-of-centre think tank, so I'm really worried about that. So much to worry about. Rachel Reeves, look, God knows, I've met Rachel Reeves. I've sat in her office before now. We know each other. I have no clue what she's trying to do economically. It's off the wall. Madness. I mean, that's what I mean by that.
Okay, well, that's a good place to start. I mean, that's a good place to finish. Sorry, Richard, with that. I think we've kind of summarised it. You know, over this 10-year period, so much has happened. And if we were to look at an independent Scotland, let's say 2030 or 25, so much would happen over this period of time. What I've taken from this conversation is the potential and the possibility of change and things being very different if Scotland becomes independent, if it had been independent. But I just kind of finally want to say that the problems that Scotland will face over the next 10 years are significantly more difficult than they were the previous 10 because of the ecological crisis. And this idea that we're kind of walking quietly into another decade where things are just getting a little bit topsy-turvy, I think is going to be a huge wake-up call for all of our politicians. And anyone who's watching, I encourage you to find and vote for politicians who understand that there's an ecological crisis, that growth is not the way to solve it, and we really need to start thinking about things like resilience and where our wealth is now, and start to make these changes in Scotland. And if that leads to independence, fine. But if it doesn't, there's things that we've got to be doing now. And for those viewers who are tuning in across the UK, message is exactly the same across the UK. Thanks very much for joining us. Some wonderful comments. Richard, Kieran, thank you. That hour flew by, as always, Richard. Thanks very much. Thank you very much. Kieran, I'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Cheerio, everyone.
Well, we're so lucky to have Richard joining us. It's really good that we've got Richard kind of, I was going to say on call, but it's not that easy to get him. But I know he's going to be involved in a lot more with his work on the anti-austerity agenda over the coming months and who knows, maybe into years. Kieran, any final thoughts before we head off?
Yeah, I guess, it's independence still presents hope for me. And, you know, the people who want independence are amongst the happiest in Scotland because we all can see a brighter future, and we all might have different visions of it. But it's very healthy to be a pro-independence person.
Yeah. Although it is a little bit, I'm a little bit depressed about the whole situation at the moment. It must be said, but I take your point. Next week, we've got an interview that I did when Ed Conway was up in Edinburgh for the book festival. It's about his new book, Material World. It's a brilliant conversation. We mentioned Scotland a few times, but it's a real kind of look at what needs to happen in our economy if we want to have a kind of similar lifestyle we've got now and what impact that has on our ecosystem. It's a wonderful interview. It's a fantastic book. I hope you can join us next week. Well, just to let you know, we're going to change our time. Probably in a couple of weeks, we're going to do 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, but we're this time on Thursday next week. And then we'll make an announcement when we finally, Kieran, you and I can sort out our diaries and we can get out to you all. But thanks so much for joining us tonight. We'll hopefully see some of you next week. Please do like and share our episode and highlight any of the comments that you want to add as well. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.